You see a single ant on your kitchen counter, wipe it away without much thought, and tell yourself the same reassuring line almost everyone repeats in this exact moment. It's just one ant, that's not a real problem. A genuine infestation would mean dozens, hundreds, an obvious swarm you couldn't possibly miss. It's one of the most confidently repeated pieces of pest advice in casual conversation, and it feels intuitively correct. Small number, small problem. Large number, large problem. Except the actual relationship between how many ants you can see and how large the colony behind them actually is turns out to be considerably less reliable than that intuition suggests. And in a genuinely significant number of documented cases, a single visible ant tells you almost nothing meaningful about the size of the colony operating nearby. Today, we're going to break down exactly why this specific piece of pest advice fails so often, what a single ant sighting can actually tell you when you know how to read it correctly, and why waiting for enough ants to be a real problem before taking any action is, according to the actual behavioral biology involved, often exactly backwards. To understand why this myth is so misleading, it helps to understand exactly what role a single ant plays within a colony's overall foraging strategy, because as covered in earlier videos on this channel, that lone ant on your counter is almost never an isolated random occurrence. She's a scout, and her entire function within the colony depends specifically on being inconspicuous during this initial phase. Colony sending out foraging scouts does not commit large numbers of workers to an unverified location, since doing so would represent a significant unnecessary risk to colony resources if the location turns out to be unproductive or dangerous. Instead, colonies rely on a small number of individual scouts, sometimes genuinely just one or two workers at a time, to investigate new areas, assess resource quality, and report back before any larger commitment of workers occurs. This means that from the colony's own strategic perspective, a single visible ant represents an entirely intentional low-risk reconnaissance stage, one specifically designed to draw minimal attention while gathering the information that determines whether a larger, more visible foraging effort will follow. In practical terms, this means that just one ant, a homeowner dismisses, is frequently not evidence of a small or insignificant colony at all. It can just as easily represent the very first visible signal from a colony of considerable size, one that hasn't yet decided your kitchen counter is worth committing additional resources to, a decision that, as covered in earlier videos discussing pheromone trail reinforcement, can shift dramatically within a day or two of that single scout successfully reporting back. This is where the actual scale of the disconnect becomes clear, and it's worth looking at real figures, because the range of colony sizes that can plausibly exist near your home, entirely capable of producing nothing more than a single visible scout at any given moment, is considerably larger than most people assume. Depending on the specific species involved, mature ant colonies commonly range from several hundred workers in smaller, younger colonies up to, in some well-documented species, populations exceeding several 100,000 individuals within a single colony structure, with certain species capable of forming even larger interconnected supercolonies spanning multiple physically separate nest sites. A structural pattern discussed in the previous video on this channel covering polygamy and colony resilience. A colony at any point along this entire size spectrum is fully capable, at any given moment, of having only a small handful of scouts actively foraging in a specific location like your kitchen, particularly during the early investigative stage of discovering a new potential resource, or simply due to normal fluctuations in daily foraging activity that occur regardless of overall colony size. This means the statistical relationship most people intuitively assume, small visible number equals small underlying colony, simply doesn't hold up reliably against how ant colonies actually manage and deploy their foraging workforce. A colony of a few hundred individuals and a colony of tens of thousands can, under the right circumstances, both present themselves to a homeowner as nothing more than a single ant spotted once or twice over the course of a few days, making visible count, on its own, a genuinely unreliable indicator of the scale of what's actually established nearby. If a single ant sighting doesn't reliably indicate colony size, it's worth understanding what actually does, since there are more reliable behavioral and situational indicators available to anyone willing to look slightly more closely than a single glance at the counter provides. The consistency of sightings over time matters considerably more than the count at any single moment. A single ant seen once, never repeated, is more likely to represent a genuinely isolated, incidental encounter, perhaps an ant that wandered in through an open door without ever finding anything worth reporting back to her colony. A single ant seen repeatedly, appearing in roughly the same location at similar times across multiple consecutive days, is a considerably stronger signal, since it suggests either the same scout returning repeatedly or, more likely, a rotating series of scouts following an already established, if still lightly used, pheromone trail toward a resource the colony has found genuinely worth continued investigation. The speed at which visible numbers increase once they do increase provides real information about colony scale and resource commitment. As covered in earlier videos, pheromone trail reinforcement creates a feedback loop where successful foraging leads to increased worker commitment. A situation that escalates from a single ant to a dozen within a day or two suggests a colony with substantial available worker capacity ready to redirect toward a newly confirmed resource, a pattern more consistent with a larger, more established colony capable of rapid resource reallocation than a small, resource-limited one. The species involved provides meaningful context as well. As discussed in earlier videos covering ant identification, certain species like odorous house ants are known for maintaining large colonies with correspondingly extensive foraging networks, meaning even a single individual of a known large colony species warrants somewhat more attention than the same single sighting of a species typically associated with smaller colony structures. Here's the practical consequence of relying on the just one ant reassurance. And it connects directly to the pheromone-based recruitment system covered extensively in earlier videos on this channel. By the time a homeowner sees what they'd consider a genuinely convincing number of ants, the underlying situation has often already progressed considerably further than it would have been at the point the very first scout was originally spotted and dismissed. As covered previously, a single successful scout returning to the colony after discovering a viable resource lays a pheromone trail that gets progressively reinforced by every subsequent ant that successfully completes the same round trip, with trail strength and resulting worker recruitment increasing in a compounding, self-reinforcing pattern rather than a slow, linear one. This means the transition from a single occasional ant to a visible, obvious trail of dozens can occur considerably faster than most people expect once a colony has genuinely committed to a specific resource, sometimes within a day or two of that first scout's initial, easily dismissed appearance. By waiting for the visible population to reach a threshold that feels intuitively like a real problem before taking any action, a homeowner is frequently waiting until the colony has already fully confirmed and heavily committed to whatever resource drew the original scout in the first place, at which point addressing the underlying attraction, whether a food source, a moisture issue, or a structural entry point, requires considerably more thorough intervention than would have been necessary if the situation had been investigated and addressed at the single ant stage instead. This principle carries particular weight in one specific scenario covered in an earlier video on this channel: Carpenter ant activity connected to structural moisture damage. As discussed previously, Carpenter ants don't cause the underlying wood damage themselves, but rather indicate an existing moisture or decay issue they've located and begun exploiting, and this specific case illustrates why dismissing a single sighting can carry consequences well beyond simple pest inconvenience. A single, large carpenter ant spotted once near a windowsill or door frame, easily dismissed under the just one ant reasoning, may represent the very first visible indication of a moisture problem that has already been developing, unseen, within the wall structure for a considerably longer period. Because carpenter ants, as covered previously, are drawn to wood that has already been softened by existing moisture damage, their presence, even in the form of a single scout, represents a meaningful signal about the underlying condition of your home's structure, one that, left uninvestigated because it was just one ant, can allow both the ant colony's activity and the underlying moisture issue itself to progress considerably further before eventually becoming impossible to ignore in the form of a considerably larger, more established problem. This is a specific, concrete example of why treating a single ant sighting as inherently meaningless, rather than as a piece of information worth briefly investigating, can allow genuinely significant underlying issues, not just pest-related ones, to continue developing undetected for longer than they otherwise would. Rather than either panicking over a single ant or dismissing it entirely, here's a practical, proportionate way to actually evaluate what you're looking at, drawing on the identification and trail reading approaches covered in earlier videos on this channel. Note the location and check back over the following few days, rather than treating a single sighting as a one-time event to be immediately forgotten. If the same general area produces additional sightings within a short window, that consistency, as covered above, is a more meaningful signal than the original single sighting on its own. Briefly follow the ant if possible to see where she's heading or where she came from, using the trail reading approach covered in the earlier video on this channel discussing wall trails specifically. Even a single ant's direction of movement can offer a useful clue about whether she's investigating a specific resource nearby or simply passing through incidentally. Identify the species if reasonably possible, using the identification guidance covered in earlier videos, since as discussed above, certain species carry a meaningfully higher likelihood of representing large established colonies even when only a single individual is currently visible. Do a brief visual check of the immediate area for potential attractants, a spill, a crumb, a section of exposed wood, or signs of moisture, rather than assuming the ant's presence is entirely unexplainable, since as covered throughout this channel, ants are drawn to specific, identifiable resources rather than appearing randomly without cause. Bringing this together into a clear, practical response for the next time you spot a lone ant somewhere in your home. Step 1, don't immediately dismiss it, but don't panic either. A proportionate response, brief investigation rather than either extreme, is the most useful approach given everything covered in this video about how unreliable visible count alone actually is as an indicator of underlying colony size. Step 2, clean the area thoroughly regardless of how significant the sighting seems, removing any potential food residue or attractant using the approach covered in earlier videos on this channel. Since this single action addresses the most likely reason a scout investigated that specific location in the first place, regardless of how large or small the colony behind her ultimately turns out to be. Step 3, monitor the same area for a few days rather than assuming the situation is resolved after a single cleaning. As covered above, consistency of sightings over time is a more reliable signal than any single observation, and a brief period of monitoring costs very little while providing considerably more useful information than a one-time glance. Step 4, if sightings continue or increase, treat it as an active situation worth addressing directly using the bait-based and moisture investigation approaches covered in earlier videos on this channel, rather than continuing to wait for an even larger, more visually convincing population to develop before taking meaningful action. Step 5, if the single ant in question is a carpenter ant or another species specifically associated with structural moisture issues, treat the sighting as a prompt to check for underlying moisture problems specifically, given the considerably higher stakes involved compared to a simple sugar-seeking scout from a smaller species. The reassuring logic behind "it's just one ant" rests on an intuitive but ultimately inaccurate assumption that visible population size scales in a simple, predictable way with underlying colony size and commitment. As covered throughout this video, ant colonies are specifically structured, through scout-based reconnaissance and gradually reinforced recruitment, to avoid revealing their true scale until a resource has already been thoroughly investigated and confirmed, meaning the single ant dismissed on a kitchen counter is, in a genuinely significant number of cases, not evidence of a small problem at all, but simply the earliest, quietest stage of a process that, left uninvestigated, tends to escalate considerably faster than most people expect once it's already underway. None of this means every single ant sighting warrants a full pest control response. It means the size of the number you can currently see is a considerably less reliable guide than most people assume, and a brief, proportionate investigation costs far less than waiting for a problem to become large enough to be undeniable. Have you ever dismissed a single ant, only to find a much larger trail appear a few days later? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and sometimes your stories become the subject of the next video. And if you've ever wondered what another small creature quietly living in your home actually knows about your world, I think the next video might surprise you just as much as this one did. Until then, keep watching, keep wondering, and never stop paying attention to the small things.